Eric Deggans is NPR's first full-time TV critic. He's been a journalist for more than 30 years, and he teaches at Duke University. He's also the author of Race Baiter: How the Media Wields Dangerous Words to Divide a Nation. Welcome, Eric Deggans.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you with us tonight. Bob Mondello, of course, is NPR's film critic for more than 3 decades. He's reviewed movies and covered the arts for NPR. He says he sees at least 300 films a year. We're going to ask him about that. Bob Mondello is also a lover of theater, and he produced the series American Stages for NPR, which tells the story of regional theater in the U.S. Bob Mondello, thanks for being with us tonight.
It's great to be here.
So for both of you, I think a lot of us are wondering how you decide what to review. And Bob Mondello, I'll start with you because you spoke with our newest staffer, arts reporter Cheryl Lee, about restricting yourself to films opening in theaters, but you can't see all of the films opening in theaters. So what are some of your other parameters?
Well, I have to assume that when I'm looking at a film, there are a lot of pictures that are not going to appeal to the audience that we play to. I mean, NPR is a fairly sophisticated crowd. I think it's fair to say that there are lots of Marvel fans there. There are probably some horror fans there too, so I will occasionally do one of those. But I don't think every Friday the 13th movie that comes down the pike is really worthy of consideration on NPR. It needs to be something that I can interpret in some way. There's forgive me, I'm going to have to say the title. There's the new Jackass movie coming out where basically people get hurt a lot. There's nothing much to interpret with that. I mean, a critical analysis of that would be over in about 5 seconds maybe. So I avoid those. But by and large, I try to pick things that I think are interesting. I see enough films that on any given week, there's probably 7 or 8 films opening. And I see enough that I can choose what I think is the most interesting of those. So by and large, my critiques are going to be of things I like, which is helpful. And it's kind of wonderful. When you come out of a movie, I'm like everybody else. I come out of a movie and I've hated it. I really just sort of want to go and have a drink. It isn't something that I'm thrilled about talking about. If I have loved it, I cannot wait to call friends and tell them. And I get to call the entire American public, which is kind of great.
Eric Deggans, how do you decide which TV shows to review? Did you review Squid Game, which broke some viewer records for Netflix? I know you've discussed it, but I couldn't find the review.
No, I didn't review it. Sometimes it's just about timing, and sometimes it's about whether sometimes I don't. Still, we have this situation where a bunch of TV shows will debut on the same day or in the same couple of days, and then I kind of have to pick 1 or 2. I can't do them all. But basically, Bob sort of hit on the idea that we don't have to cover everything. Like, our audience does not expect us to talk about every TV show or every film that comes out. What they expect us to do is to tell them what's important and to tell them compelling stories about these products, and also give them a sense of what trends are going on and what do they need to know about film, TV, and media that's going to affect their daily lives. And so that's how those are the 3 things that I kind of use to sort of figure out what I'm going to talk about is, can I tell a compelling story about it? Does it somehow connect to something that the audience needs to know, should know, or wants to know? And ultimately, is it something important? So sometimes I'll end up doing reviews of shows that I'm not that into, but the show is so big that I know I have to talk about it. Frankly, I can't recall the last time I was in that situation, although the Sex and the City reboot came close.
Okay, that's not important? That's hugely important.
No. In terms of a show that's important, but a show that I didn't care that much about. because the first couple of episodes weren't great, but once I got to see 4 of them, and the 2 after the first 2 kind of stoked my interest a little more. But going into it, I sort of thought, I mean, I know I have to talk about this. I'm just not sure, I personally care that much. But the thing is, like if it's a show that's big enough for people to care about, usually it's also a show that is significant creatively enough that there's a lot to say about it. But those are the yardsticks that I use.
So I'm going to get to some viewer questions in a second, and we have several people asking the same question. So I promise you we're going to get to that. But I bet you can even guess what it is.
Oh yeah, this is the one that Bob and I love talking about.
But first, ethical lines for you guys. Most of us are aware of some of the obvious ethical lines for reporters. For instance, recusing yourself from covering a story that you might have a personal stake in, or not giving coverage to people as a favor or for payment or promotional reasons, telling the truth, citing your sources.
Wait a minute, we can't do that? No.
So really basic stuff. But what are some of the ethical lines in film or TV criticism that people might not have thought about? What do you guys have to be aware of? And what boundaries do you have to have in place for yourself? Bob Mondello, we'll start with you.
I was hoping you'd start with Eric on that one. Ethical lines, I don't, listen, all my friends are movie stars, so I, would have to recuse myself from absolutely everything. I don't know a single famous person, I don't think, except for Eric. I'm trying to think if so those kinds
Audie Cornish.
That's true, Audie Cornish.
Those folks are more famous than Susan Stamberg. She's more famous.
That is true. She's actually been to my house, which is a thrill. She's Susan. When they do the Susan Stamberg story, I am definitely not recusing myself. However, because I know her story backwards and forwards. She's the one who got me started at NPR. She's our founding mother, and I would not be here without her. But in general, I have been in touch with a couple of famous people over the years, mostly when they respond to something I've written. I otherwise don't know people in Hollywood. I am 3,000 miles from Hollywood. And a lot of the films that I talk about are films that are produced by independent filmmakers. So that I don't really have to think too much about boundaries when I'm looking at something. There are things that interest me more than other things, and there are things that I don't know very well. There's some. If you asked me to review a movie about football, I would have serious problems and would have to talk to a lot of people before I could make sure that I was right about it. On the other hand, I think nothing of going and commenting on superheroes, and I haven't met any of them either. So I suppose on some level, I'm fearless when I go in there, and I just sort of try to describe what's going on. In terms of my criticism, I tend to be a very descriptive as opposed to a prescriptive critic. Meaning that the thumbs up part is not interesting to me, whether I liked it or not. What was the director trying to do, and did they manage to do it well, is fascinating to me. And those questions don't end up being things that trigger ethical questions usually. If I'm describing something, I have to review films by people who have gotten into trouble in one way or another. Kevin Spacey, for instance. There are a lot of Mel Gibson. There are a lot of people who do things that put them in the public eye in a way that they probably wish they had not been put in the public eye. And I still have to comment on their work, and I probably have to write an obit on them and that kind of thing. So those kinds of things come up, and there you have to deal with things that are tricky to say sometimes. But I don't really think of it as putting me in an ethically dicey situation. I'm pretty sure where I stand on most moral questions. So.
Yeah. Eric Deggans, do people send you baskets of food and wine and things?
They do.
Liquor, serious amounts of liquor.
Most of that stuff goes to Goodwill, or unfortunately in the trash if it's food. But that's, I mean, they'll send that stuff. I'm a member of the Critics choice. I'm a member of the group that does the Critics Choice Awards, and there's a bunch of those. So they send a bunch of stuff to all of us, and there's 500 of us. So and I'm a member of the TV Critics Association, and there's over 200 of us. And so they're always sending us stuff, but that's not really going to affect how you review something. At least it's not going to affect how I review something. I am, and I was going to say, Bob does know superheroes because he knows Nina Totenberg and he knows Susan Stanberg. So, but in my case, I'm professionally acquainted with some of the people that I might have to do stories about. I've known Ava DuVernay for a long time. I've known Nicole Hannah-Jones for a while. I've known W. Kamau Bell for a while, but I criticized something on his show on CNN, and I'm going to be interviewing him as part of the Sundance Festival tomorrow. So I think these guys understand that when I'm a critic, I have to call it how I see it, even though we may have kind of a friendly professional acquaintanceship. You know what I mean? For me, the ethics part of it is more about being honest with your audience about your point of view and why you hold it and the evidence that supports your point of view. So, I tend to do columns that talk a bit about race, that talk a bit about society, that talk a bit about what media industries are doing or not doing to support civil rights and to advance equality. And so I have to be honest about what the evidence that backs up my point of view. And I have to be honest about the evidence that maybe doesn't back up my point of view. And I think, people on either side of those issues get bent out of shape because people who don't want to believe what you're saying will take any little, fact or any little blip to try and invalidate what you're saying. And then people who agree with you get upset when you acknowledge that the other side may have a point or two. And we face this a lot, I think, at NPR because we try very hard to be honest brokers. We try very hard to be fair about what we're saying. So we're going to take our time and amass a lot of evidence before we say somebody lied about something, for example. And there's been a lot of criticism of us for that, but I think our audience expects that of us. Our status is as at least being seen to work as hard as we can to be an honest broker is a big part of our identity, and it's a big part of what I do as a journalist and a pundit and a quote unquote thought leader. So for me, that's where the ethics come into it. It's hard sometimes to be an honest broker when you feel like why something is one way or another. But I'm constantly talking to my students at Duke and telling them that you have to have facts to back up what your feelings are. One of the biggest problems I think with this modern media age is that people assume things are true because they feel that they are true. They are drowning in truthiness, and they are drowning in misinformation. And now more than ever, we need to insist that people base their feelings on facts. And if they're not facts to support those feelings, then perhaps they should reconsider them.
Yeah. I'm going to go to some audience questions now. Jamie Scott, hello, Jamie, says, I love seeing movies in theaters, sharing the experience with a live audience, no matter how good the content is on my streaming services at home. The movie theater experience cannot be replicated. Do you think the movies as an industry and favored form of entertainment for many Americans will survive the pandemic? She says, please say yes. Vic Roberts also, thank God for the small screen, increased streaming, but what does it mean for cinemas? Patricia Ahern is asking if movie theaters are going to survive the pandemic. Bob Mondello.
Yes, they're going to survive the pandemic. Not all of them, and already we've lost some, but yes, the fact of movie going is not going to go away. The thing that I'm a little worried about is that the movies that we see in movie theaters are going to become broader and bigger and splashier, as opposed to more thoughtful and thought-provoking. But that will have. I mean, essentially, we're going to have to see how it shakes out. This is currently a COVID problem. At some point in the future, it will become a production problem with what is being produced for the big screen. And the danger of what's happened during this last couple of years is that so much has shifted to streaming that it may be hard to pull it back out. What is happening currently is that younger people are going to the movies in theaters, and that older folk are staying at home. And I've done some thinking about that, and I get that. I mean, listen, I'm an older person myself. I'm 72, and I think I would be uncomfortable in a crowded theater at this point. I'm fully, vaxxed and boosted and all that, but I don't think it would be entirely safe for me to be in it. Now, I have been to theaters. I was in theaters at the very beginning of the pandemic when they were showing us films, but they were doing it in a very careful way, where there would be 7 of us in an auditorium of 450 seats, so that it was absolutely safe. And I think the question is soon, when the pandemic when COVID becomes something that we're all sort of used to having around, and it has been reduced to a level where we can deal with it the way we do with the flu. I think then the question is what's happening. What I would argue for people in general who are worried about this is that if you don't occasionally go to the films that you care about, those films are not going to be shown in theaters soon. Now, I'm not suggesting that people should risk their lives to go to the theater, but I do want them to realize that except for Friday and Saturday nights, theaters are generally not crowded. That if you go to a midweek matinee of something, you are likely to be the only person sitting in the theater. That, for instance, West Side Story, which is a picture that appealed or should appeal to people over 40, because they're more aware of that piece of work than people under 40. That film was playing within a week after it opened to such small crowds midweek that you could have gone entirely safely to most theaters that were playing it, and not encountered anybody else. Again, I'm not urging people to do something that they're not comfortable with, but it is possible to social distance in a theater in that situation when there are 4 or 5 people in a fairly large house. Theaters have gone out of their way to improve their air circulation systems and things like that. They have done all the things that they need to do according to the CDC. And so I think if you're talking about going indoors to a public space, it may be one of the safer spaces out there. Certainly it's safer than a restaurant where you're unmasked and you're talking to people as opposed to all facing in the same direction. People have different levels of comfort with that, but I think theaters will come back, and the theaters are coming back. I mean, look, Spider-Man brought theaters back, made $1 billion in the space of a very short time. But it's the smaller films, the things that we're going to be looking at as the award season kicks in, that are the ones that I would worry about. And it would kill me if they all went to Eric's sphere of influence. Eric gets to review anything that's on television exclusively, and I do things that are, on the big screen exclusively. I hope he'll let me cover them.
Well, FX, the FX network counts, like how many series had original episodes every year. And they figured out that 559 series had original episodes in 2021. So I don't need any more work. I'll say that right now. And I'll also say that I'm going to surprise Bob by saying that I agree with him that theaters are not going away. I've often said that I think that new types of media, they don't destroy old types of media. They just force them to change. So movie theaters and the theater industry is going to get smaller. It's going to. And the thing is, these dynamics that have been shrinking the theater industry have been happening way before COVID. One of the things that's happening, for example, is that mid-level movies, your $50, $60 million movies, are generally not made anymore. They're made for streaming, and they're made for television. They're turned into limited series. 10 or 15 years ago, and I'm sure Bob would agree with me on this, like Mayor of Easttown, that HBO series that Kate Winslet starred in, would have been a film. 10 or 15 years ago, a lot, Big Little Lies, which starred Nicole Kidman and Reese Witherspoon and Shailene Woodley, that would have been a film. Sharp Objects, which starred Amy Adams, that would have been a film. Though these things, these smaller movies, especially projects starring women of a certain age, are becoming streaming. So, and that was happening before COVID. COVID has just sped up all of these things that are already turning the media industry towards streaming and away from theaters. The other thing is Wall Street is much more interested in media companies that have robust and growing streaming services. So it has pushed Disney and Warner Brothers and these media companies, Comcast and these media companies that all also make film. Amazon, it's pushed them to take projects that they might have tried in theaters and move them into streaming, or at least shorten the window between when they're in the theaters and when they go to streaming, because Wall Street is so interested in streaming services. When Netflix announced that it fell short of its subscriber goals, the value of the company went down by $50 million. Wall Street is watching this very closely. And again, this was a dynamic that was in place before COVID hit, when we saw that Apple and Disney and HBO Max and Peacock, that all these streaming services were going to start hitting the market, and they were all going to be competing against each other for projects and for subscribers. So all COVID did was speed this up. But now it's forcing consumers to say to themselves, do I want to go to a theater, risk getting the Omicron variant for a movie that I can watch in my home in 3 weeks? And if it's a movie that's intimate, where I want to watch it without worrying about whether the guy behind me is eating potato chips, or whether the person in front of me is on their phone, or getting to a place at a specific time, paying for parking, paying for popcorn, all of that is gone when you watch it at home. And so I think the theater industry has not stepped up enough to deal with the fact that it is much easier for people to stay home and watch these products. They have to make the theater experience more impressive and more distinctive. It can't just be buying a ticket, buying some popcorn, and watching a great story on the big screen. It's got to be more than that. And so far, I feel like that's the big criticism I have for the theater industry. I don't think they've risen to that challenge.
My problem is that they're making it seem too much like being at home. In most of the theaters that are near me, we now have what amount to Barca loungers, so that I can put my feet go up. I've got a cup holder on the side. It feels more and more as if I'm being isolated from my fellow patrons, which during the COVID break is a valid thing. Yeah, I keep noting to myself that I have lived through several times when the film industry, where movie theaters were going to die. One of them was that I'm old enough to remember when television came in, and basically all of a sudden there's TV, and so the screen got wide, and you started producing things like Ben-Hur, and everything was freaking enormous, because they had to give you an experience that you could not get on the small screen. And that's when movies basically went from black and white to color. I mean, it was possible earlier, but a lot of films were still done in black and white, but television was only black and white initially. So all of a sudden you've got colorful movies like you can't believe. They're just gorgeous. And the same thing is, pardon me? Technicolor, exactly. And then when Disney started the wonderful world of color on television, you needed something else, and so they did other things. The when DVDs came in, following just sort of what were they called? VCRs, not VCRs. What do I mean? VHSs. That when those things came in, each of them was going to kill film going, right? And each of them, every year you have more money coming in movie theaters. For as long as a studio can release a film and make $1 billion in a few weeks in theaters, they're going to continue doing that, right? And chasing that particular dream. And if you're making a smaller film cheaply and something that would not necessarily be seen by a lot of people if it was put on Netflix, because people wouldn't be aware of it in a way, then I think those films will continue to come to movie theaters too. One of the things right now, believe it or not, I'm attending Sundance, right? And it's a virtual experience. So I can see it at home, and I can go to a screening as soon as we stop talking, right? I can do it. So I get the convenience factor of being at home. But the films that come out of Sundance, if they exclusively go to streaming, I'll be surprised. It seems to me that the buzz you create at a film festival like that is going to help the movies to find their audience in movie theaters. Then they'll go to streaming, and they'll be more valuable to the companies. And I think, as far as I can tell, all the major studios are aware that they don't want theaters to go away. The studios want things to show up on streaming as quickly as possible, and theater owners would rather that they had a longer window in movie theaters first, and that they're going to be negotiating for years. I don't think it's always going to be 3 weeks, but we'll see. You never know.
Well, the thing that's interesting to me is that if you look at the top films that came out of Sundance last year, if you look at Coda and if you look at Summer of Soul, both of those films didn't do great at the box office,
right?
But there was a lot of interest in them when they hit streaming. Summer of Soul, in particular, was big for Hulu. So, it's going to be hard, I think, for films at Sundance to get the kind of payday that Coda got. I mean, that was what, $25 million deal. And I think Summer of Soul did 10 or 15, something like that. I think it's going to be hard for those films to get that much money when the sense is that they're probably going to perform better on streaming than they are in theaters.
Well, the question is whether, Coda is maybe a special case, but I've seen films at this festival that I can't imagine anybody just out of the blue tuning into on streaming, because there's so much out there that has bigger stars. The thing about independent cinema sometimes is that the little film needs to get a foothold someplace until people are talking about it and then be shown in streaming. And I think I hope that is the model that happens. I just enjoyed the hell out of a film called Cha-Cha Real Smooth, right? And I think it's wonderful, but it stars a kid who's 23 years old, who wrote and directed the film, and who is a charmer, Cooper Raif. He's really kind of wonderful. This is his second movie. I don't think if you put that on Netflix tomorrow, it's going to have a whole lot of people checking it. When it plays in theaters first and is raved about in a smaller setting and then goes to Netflix, I think, or I'm making up a streamer, but then goes to a streamer, I think it will be more valuable. And I'm hoping that that's what happens with the smaller films that I find more interesting in theaters.
Eric Deggans.
If it goes on Netflix though, and it's promoted through their landing page and their algorithms, then people will find it. And that's I think that's the struggle that's going on with streamers, especially Netflix now, is that that people who are making smaller projects are pushing Netflix to present their products to their subscribers more consistently and more visibly. I think Squid Game is a good example of a product that you wouldn't have imagined anybody would know. There's no actors in that that many American consumers know, but it became a huge hit in part because once it started to catch on with people who watch Korean dramas, Netflix's algorithm worked to get it in front of other people.
And so, Eric Deggans, going back to your comment about movie theaters and movie theater owners needing to make the experience more impressive, how can they do that? What do you mean by that? Are you talking about the content that they offer, the experience? What does that mean?
I'm talking about the entire experience. For example, there's a chain of theaters. Some of them are here, but they're in others. I'm in Florida. Some of them are here in Florida. They're in other states too. It's called Cena Bistro, and this is sort of it curates kind of a little more upscale experience. So they serve alcohol, so you have to be over 21 to go. They do serve dinner, so they encourage you to come like 45 minutes early and then have dinner and then watch the film. But because it's a curated experience where they have ushers and, because they're in and out and serving food and they have a lot of people around, you can't really use your phone, you can't really talk. Because of the age requirement, you don't have a lot of young people messing around anyway, and for more adult films, it's a much more enjoyable experience. You're going to go to a situation where you can have a cocktail, you can sit back, and you can actually enjoy the film. The people next to you are not going to be disruptive, and everything is just a more controlled environment. It is possible. I'm not saying every theater has to be like that. I'm just saying it is possible, to have more ushers so that when people are disruptive, they are immediately dealt with. It is possible to have more people working behind the counter so that you don't have to wait in line for 15 minutes to get your popcorn and to get a drink. It is possible to clean the theaters more often, so that when you go to sit down, your foot isn't going into some sticky thing and you don't even know what it is. I've had those experiences in the last 3 or 4 months in theaters, every one of them. And so, you have to make the average theater goer's experience higher quality, which means they have to hire more people. And it means they also have to spend more time thinking about what that experience is. You can't just put up, the latest films and hire a few people and, charge your exorbitant fees for candy and popcorn and hope your business model sticks together. I don't understand it. It reminds me of when newspapers were facing this existential threat from online platforms that were taking their classified ad business, and eBay and Monster.com and Craigslist was eviscerating their business model, and they didn't really do anything about it. And now newspapers are a shadow of what they used to be. This is what the movie business is facing. And I don't understand why they aren't seeing it as an existential threat. And if they don't respond to it that way, man, they're going to be greatly diminished.
Well, trust me, they do see it as an existential threat. Their answer to that threat is longer windows, so that things don't go directly to streaming and everybody doesn't take the attitude that they can see things immediately. I don't disagree about the things you're saying, and I'm sorry that theaters in your area sound absolutely horrible. I don't have that problem when I go to screenings for the most part, but again, I'm not attending with large crowds, and there hasn't just been a large crowd in the theater 10 minutes earlier, right? So that hasn't been my experience. I usually, when they show us films as critics, they tend to show them early in the day. There's been a night since there was a crowd there, and they've had time to clean. So it isn't, and they don't sell popcorn, and I don't like popcorn, so I don't eat it anyway. But that makes that part simpler for me. I don't spend the extra money. I used to work in the exhibition business. I used to work for a chain of movie theaters here in Washington that spread around the Middle Atlantic states. And one of the things I learned about the business is that you pay enough money to the studio, more than 50% of every dime that comes in at the box office goes to the studio, and it's up as much as 90% in the opening couple of weeks. So that the selling the refreshments is where you make your money as a theater. My boss at the chain of movie theaters urged me to think of a theater as a large dark room attached to the concession stand, and that the concession stand was what mattered, right? And I get that. I think the building of multiplexes was designed to create a staff that could handle a whole bunch of places at once, and the concession stand would be central, but there would be all these dark rooms around them. The theatrical model has changed a great deal over the years, and they're forever adapting, and I'm sure they'll adapt again. I keep expecting holograms at some point, so we'll get closer to live theater. It'll be very exciting.
Well, and I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but I am going to say that I think most people who go to theaters, average theaters, can agree that the food is not that great. I mean, if your business is built around selling people food, and your business is threatened, then why don't you make the food better? Why don't you make the lines shorter?
Well,
there's a lot of things. There's a lot of things the theater business can do if they really saw it as an existential threat. Changing the window by which a movie plays in the theater versus going to streaming, that's not how you respond to an existential threat. And so I don't see them doing the kinds of things that tells the audience, we care about your business, we want you here, we understand that there's all these things, there's all these reasons why you don't need to come out, so let us do these things to beg you to come back. They are not doing it, and I don't understand it. I don't understand it because they go away if they don't do it.
Yeah, I hear you. The difference, I think what we're talking about two different animals, and I guess part of my love of theater is that love of the cinema experience is that I come from live theater. That's where what I started reviewing when I was a kid, and live theater was always threatened by movies, which were threatened by television, right? So that you had all these removes from it. And when I was growing up, there were a whole lot of repertory theaters. There were a couple here in Washington. Wherever I went, I could find a theater that was showing films to a select audience that were of cinephiles, people who were actually interested in movies and who weren't going for the popcorn and who weren't going for anything else. They were going because they wanted to see something that was really interesting. Independent movie theaters still have that cachet, and independent movie theaters do all the things you're suggesting. It's not so much that they're creating a culinary experience at the theater. They are curating the movies and making sure that their audience feels like a community and making. Listen, I know theater owners who were calling regular patrons at the beginning of the COVID pandemic and making sure that everybody was okay. It was family, right? They were responding to them as family. If you're going to one of the big chains, the experience is just different. And I agree with you that that experience is not what I think of as movie going. I think of going to the smaller theater that is owned by somebody in the neighborhood where that person cares about movies and will sit there in the lobby and talk to you for 20 minutes afterwards because they're delighted you're so fascinated with this foreign film you just saw. I mean, that is the experience that I hope is maintained as we go forward. It is the reason I'm a critic. It is the reason I got into films in the first place. It is magical, and I can't reproduce that on a small screen.
Well, I'll tell you, the metropolitan area where I live, there is one theater that fits that description.
Mm-hmm.
One.
Yeah.
And there is one theater that fits that description in the Cape Fear region as well. And I think, Bob Mondello, you just answered Mary Bradley's question about whether that will survive, because WHQR public media has a partnership with Thalian Hall, which produces Cinematique. So are you saying that?
I think I actually spoke there once, which was just like,
Yes.
Thalian Hall is a beautiful hall. It's just gorgeous, and it better survive. I mean, it's just extraordinary. But yes, I think that kind of experience, that it is tough for them, and it is important that their family support them. But I think that particular kind of theater is going to continue to exist. And to be honest, I'm much more concerned about them and their survival than I am about the big chains that are playing Spider-Man, right? I mean, they are going to be fine, but I think the smaller theaters are the ones that people feel strongly about and will continue to support.
I mean, I want to get to like that's like the film industry is I mean, if the larger chains don't figure out how to deal with bringing people in, the smaller film houses won't have anything to show. I mean, the film industry right now is these huge multiplexes, and they are failing to serve their customers.
I want to ask you guys about leaving bad reviews, because I've wondered about this a lot myself. Taylor Montalto, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is also asking, do you ever have difficulty doing that? And I've wondered, you walk into a film, you understand the genre, you probably understand quite a bit about what you're likely to get before you go in. And if it's a genre that you just dislike across the board, but you're reviewing it because everybody's going to be talking about it or whatever the reason is, with a TV series as well, do you ever think I should temper my negative reaction a little bit?
No, absolutely not. If I don't like something, you're going to hear it. If I felt I had to pull punches, oh my goodness, that would be awful. My reaction to this, I imagine Eric feels similarly, is that the job of writing a review is not simply to reflect what is up there, but to reflect it in a way that makes it interesting. You find the kernel of something that makes it interesting. Now, sometimes let's take an example: Twilight. All right, the Twilight movies. They are vampire flicks. They are vampire and Wolfman flicks. I mean, they are nuts, right? They are a critic for NPR wrote the best opening line ever about them for the first Twilight movie. It's Ken Turan. He was brilliant, and he wrote a line I wish I had written. He said at the beginning of his first review of a Twilight movie, "I am not now, nor have I ever been, a 12-year-old girl." And I cracked up and thought, yes, that is exactly. But he still went on to review the film in a way that was really entertaining and interesting. And I take my cue from that. I mean, I try to make the review interesting in and of itself, and to be clever about the way that I skewer something if I have to skewer it. I mean, if you start out a review about a movie about vampires by saying this movie sucks, it's a cute joke, I suppose, but it means that there's no reason for anyone to listen to the rest of your review, right? So you craft a review in a way that sort of works into the things you don't like about it. The struggle for me is not whether to say negative things, but how to say them in a way that doesn't make everybody if a film like Twilight has a big fan base, and the instant you say something negative about it, they're going to tune away, then I'm going to find a clever way to get them involved in my argument before they get a chance to tune away, right? So I will involve them, and I do that with a lot of description and those kinds of things, and as many times as I can, we're using puns and other things to hold your interest, in the hopes that you'll also hear what I have to say about the picture. Sometimes it's more inferred than slammed, but yeah.
And the morning show, Eric Deggans, it's a
Yeah.
great example of a series a lot of people are talking about. You
Sure.
characterized it as a sophisticated soap opera, which also strains to be about something
Right.
capitalized, even when it's not clear exactly what that something is.
Yeah.
It sounds like you hated this series. You said it could just be a celebrity packed excuse to watch A-list actors yell at each other. But you also noted that in this age when white people are trying to learn they're not the center of the world, and Hollywood is moving in the direction of more diverse casts and diverse in a lot of different ways, this seems to fail in a pretty big way for you.
Mhm.
Can you talk about how you think Hollywood is doing along those lines?
Sure. Well, first, I do want to talk a little bit about the negative review thing, which is like, for me, I have to figure out, am I reacting negatively to something because it's terrible or because it doesn't speak to me? And those are two different things. And so a good example of that is the White Lotus, the HBO limited series. I hated that show. And it was on a lot of people's best of lists. A lot of people love it. People even now, they can't wait for the second season of it. And I should have done a piece about why I hate it. But I eventually sort of concluded that show does not speak to me. It's not that the show is not well done. It's not that it doesn't have great performances. It's not that it wasn't exploring some intriguing ideas. It didn't speak to me, and the things that it said to me, I felt were not worth an 8-hour limited series to discover. Right. So that's my struggle when it comes to negative stuff, is to make sure that I'm hating something for the right reasons. And if I'm not liking something because it doesn't speak to me, it makes me be more careful about writing about it, because there's a bunch of other people that it does speak to, and I got to respect that. Right. So as far as how Hollywood's doing, what I think is happening is that we've reached this point where we had a lot of really great projects that reflect a lot of diversity and reflect previously marginalized people getting a chance to tell their stories in film and in television. And it's been wonderful to see. But I think Hollywood is getting complacent. I think Hollywood is starting to feel like, oh, we're solving this thing. We got this highly touted, movie, featuring deaf culture. We've got, the Underground Railroad, this amazing limited series focused on Black people. We've got, and people are getting complacent. And I'm starting to see, projects come out where I'm like, wait a minute. What happened here? How come this was like that? The morning show was a perfect example. And I tried to speak with Mimi Leader, the director who was involved with putting together a lot of it, about the first season and how flawed it was, and how it turned, arguably its most prominent Black female character into some kind of noble victim when it didn't have to. And she kind of blew me off. And I thought it was endemic in how the show goes about giving its stars these amazing moments to act without any thought for what that means for the story or what it means for what the show is saying. And we're at a time when every actual morning show on network television is centered on people of color. Gayle King is the star of CBS This Morning. Robin Roberts is the star of Good Morning America. Hoda Kotb is the star of the Today Show. So why do we have a show on Apple TV about a network TV morning show that stars two white women? It blows my mind. And so, I think part of it is that we just have to keep reminding Hollywood that just because you've had success last year or the year before, that does not mean you're going to have success on this issue the next year, unless you're constantly pushing and constantly trying to do more and trying to do better.
Well, does this speak to the notion that we still don't have enough diversity, gender diversity, racial diversity, uh, in terms of storytellers or gatekeepers and or producers, the people who are making the content?
I mean, yes, of course. I mean, I just saw a story in the Wrap, which is like a trade magazine and website, that said that just 27% of the films that are thought to be Oscar contenders were directed by women. So yeah, I mean, that's part of it. But I also think that part of it is that the money making apparatus that surrounds the creative process is entirely not diverse. Hollywood is making inroads in terms of directors and executive producers and people behind the scenes who are getting some agency to tell their stories. But the executives who run these companies, the people who run Wall Street that finance these companies, the huge apparatuses that are set up to take these projects and monetize them across the globe, sell them to markets in Europe and in Russia, in China, in Latin America. All of that is incredibly not diverse. And so when you have an apparatus that is still not inclined towards ensuring that these projects that feature people of color are successful financially, are successful in every market they could be successful in, then you wind up having this weird catch-22 where you have product come out, it doesn't do as well as it could have, and then all of a sudden people are finding excuses for not doing the same thing again. So it's I think our main problem right now is complacency, and you got to constantly convince people that we still haven't gotten to the point where we can take a breath. We've got to keep pushing. We've got to keep our eye on the ball and make sure that levels of diversity increase and that diversity positively impacts the projects that are being created.
And will that, if we are able to increase diversity, does that mean that the trend that Bob Mondello identified a few minutes ago about films being released in theaters needing to be bigger and splashier, and I could be wrong in terms of how I interpreted this, but it sounded like it also meant they were going to be lower quality, less interesting.
Marvel is wonderfly high quality, as Eric will happily tell you. Now that I've reviewed how many of them, is it 27 yet? The answer is that there is a more diverse world, even at Marvel, right? That is being explored, sort of. I look at last year at the Oscars. It was the most diverse year at the Oscars ever, by miles. Women and persons of color were throughout the system. And when I tried to explain to myself why that was true, I realized that what had happened was that the Steven Spielbergs of the world, the people who had real clout, had managed to have their films delayed. And the people with less clout had not been able to get out of the way of the pandemic. So you were releasing pictures into theaters that were by people who don't usually have clout. And it was terribly unfair, but it worked to the advantage, for instance, of Nomadland, which was produced by a woman of color, which was directed by a woman of color, which featured a mostly woman staff that was, I mean, in a lot of respects, that picture and the Ma Rainey and a bunch of other films were able to shine in theaters at a time when, unfortunately, they weren't going to make very much money. So the producers of those films made a sort of a Faustian bargain that they would take the celebrity of the moment, right? Take the fact that they could just sort of eviscerate everything else in the marketplace because they were so good, at the expense of the dollars they would have taken in at the box office. Whereas, say, Steven Spielberg decided not to do that with West Side Story, and they postponed it for a year. And Tom Cruise decided not to do that, and they postponed Top Gun. And so, it was an extraordinary year. It was fantastic. It was the first year in ages that I've been interested in what was in the Oscar ceremony. But it comes with caveats, and those caveats are all business caveats. They are the big companies decide things on bases that are just, there's sort of a central dysfunctional relationship in Hollywood between race and product, and it's a terrible thing. And diversity needs to get better in that system, in almost every system in American society. But the questions of this sort are going to take years to resolve. They took a lot of years to put into place in the first place. I think we're making strides, but you can't really tell. And I gotta say, the things that are leading the Oscar race this year do not seem to be diverse in the same way. That distresses me enormously.
One of the things that used to bug me, for example, is that there was this dictum in the industry that films and TV shows that featured casts of color, non-white cast, didn't do well overseas, didn't do well in Europe, and didn't do well in China. And so it was an excuse to not put a lot of money behind products and projects that would feature these kinds of casts. And so I went and I looked at the box office for a film that's widely regarded as a bomb, After Earth, which is this film that Will Smith made with his son. It's a science fiction film, right? In America, it tanked, but overseas, 60% of its revenue came from overseas. That movie made money because people love Will Smith overseas. And in fact, if you looked at a lot of films between, say, 2014 and 2019 that starred mostly Black casts, like some of the biggest films, they did well overseas, including, of course, Black Panther, which kind of shattered that notion for a lot of people. But I was always, it always bugged me because there were plenty of projects that proved that was nonsense before then. But what you find is that people in the industry sometimes come up with these explanations that sound like they're rooted in business and in facts and in data, but they're really rooted in stereotypes and assumptions.
Right.
Because when you actually look at the facts, you find a different story. And so I think part of what we have to do in order to really reach equality is not only keep pushing, but push back against these people who keep saying, "Oh, everything's too woke. Everything, cancel culture. Oh my God, be afraid of it." It's nonsense. It's nonsense. We really need to keep pushing and keep looking. I mean, God bless Peter Dinklage for speaking up about this idea to remake Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And he's like the name of the project is insulting to little people. Hey, I'm glad he's speaking up. And now, Disney says they're going to somehow do it in a different way that's not as insulting. But, that was my thought too. Like, why are they even bothering remaking that movie? It would be like somebody telling me that they're remaking Uncle Tom's Cabin or something. Like, really? Do we need that? So we have to constantly remind Hollywood, constantly remind them that the reason why diversity is important is because if there's somebody in the room who has a different perspective, maybe they can stop you from sinking, $60 million or $100 million in a project that's completely insulting. I still want to hear from Lin-Manuel Miranda how in the world In the Heights wound up as colorist as it was. Because the minute I saw it, I love the movie, but I thought to myself, like, where are the Afro-Cubans? Where are the Afro-Latinos in this? Like, why is everybody white except for the African American? And I would have thought that the guy who created Hamilton would have understood that. And I can't. It blows my mind that movie got to theaters before they realized, hey, there was a problem. Well, I mean, I don't believe it. They must have known, and I just don't know why they let the casting go forward the way they did. But the public reaction forced them to recant, and you better believe Lin-Manuel Miranda is going to think twice before making another movie that's that colorist.
Yeah, and when we talk about stories that are about people of color, there's so much from just American history that a lot of us are learning about now, stories we didn't know, lots of stories to mine and tell. And Will Blake wrote in before we started this webinar and asked what's up with the Harlem Hellfighters graphic novel adaptation, allegedly out of Will Smith's production company. And I saw there was a piece in the Hollywood Reporter back in 2017 about it becoming a limited series on the History Channel. I was after Sony decided not to do the film. Have either of you heard about this? And by the way, the Hellfighters, I had to look this up, were the most celebrated African-American regiment in World War I, confronted racism while training for war, helped bring jazz to France, a more than worthwhile story. Do you know about the status of this project? Have you heard of it?
I am aware of the Hellfighters. I'm not aware of a movie about them. Eric, I don't know. Do you?
That sounded vaguely familiar. But I have to say I haven't heard anything about that project. And I will say that one thing that I do think the industry is still has a hard time getting behind is period pieces about Black casts that are not about slavery. I still think that's a tough mountain to climb in Hollywood. There's a sense that there's not enough general interest in those stories to put money behind them, and that's another one of those, George Lucas, of course, famously bankrolled a movie about the Tuskegee Airmen that failed because in part, well, I thought it failed because the movie wasn't that good, but but it also failed in terms of international distribution and things like that, and people used that film as a way to sort of reinforce this idea that movies with Black cast don't travel, and Ma Rainey's Black Bottom didn't do well in the theaters either, did it?
No, I don't think it ever would have been regarded as a surefire box office smash. It did have Chadwick Boseman in it at a moment that was extremely powerful for audiences, and I think and I personally thought it was a gorgeous film. I think what the I don't know. I can't answer the question though about that particular film. I don't know anything about it. I can look it up, and we can get back to you on it. But forgive me. Right now, I have been for the last month. I have been obsessing over the films that are going to be at Sundance. And shortly, I'm going to be obsessing over the films that are going to open in the spring. I haven't even started thinking about this summer yet, let alone things that are in the pipeline. But I will get to them. And what's coming down the pike in general is what we're getting right now in movie theaters. I think it's probably different in streaming and in TV. What we're getting right now in movie theaters is a lot of films that have been postponed, so that we're getting a sort of a mad rush of big product coming out between now and the end of the year. So that in theory, at least, this year is going to be immensely profitable in movie theaters because there's a lot of stuff out there. There are a lot of those films do involve casts of color. So I think there's a reasonable expectation that we're going to see some interesting stuff. But what gets swamped and what doesn't, whether there's another variant that comes along and slows down movie theaters, you can't predict any of that. It's like fingers crossed all the time.
Definitely.
Yeah. Joanne Levitan asks, and this is for either of you. She says, in my experience, there are films and TV programs that are critically acclaimed, but not popular with audiences. For example, the films The Favorite and The Lobster. Can you talk about the difference between what film critics look for in a film or TV program and what audiences look for, and whether you consider that when you write your reviews?
Hell no. Yeah, of course you do. I mean, you have to. But as a practical matter, the audience, a large portion of the audience, is looking for things that are familiar. If you're going to go out and spend whatever $10 to $15 on a movie ticket to go to a theater, you want to see something that you're reasonably sure you're going to enjoy. And the way that you are sure of that is that it is something that is familiar to you. It's the reason for casting stars. It is, I mean, all those kinds of things. And it's the reason that Marvel is a formula that is now regarded as safe for a large portion of the audience, and they want to go see things. I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. The basics. Rephrase the question, or give me.
So that gap that we see from time to time between what critics think is good and what audiences appreciate.
What I am looking for as a critic is often not what is familiar. I mean, I've been joking about it about Marvel, but I am interested in seeing something that surprises me. And I think audiences are delighted by surprise once they're sure that it's not going to be in some way disappointing, right? But audiences are more inclined to go with things that they already know than critics who are seeing those. I mean, I see films that look like other films all the time, that feel like other films, feel like films that have already been successful. Those films are less interesting to me because they're rehashing things that I already know. They may be more interesting or more attractive to a general audience member because they reflect things that they know. And so it's a function of I have to see 300 films in a year, and a lot of them are going to be very, very familiar feeling. The ones that aren't are the ones that, my eyes go wider and, oh my gosh, this is exciting. And The Favorite was a good example of that. Olivia Colman doing just remarkable work. I mean, just fascinating work, but being so surprising at every second in that film. And so, yeah, I mean, I think in general, I'm looking for things that take interesting chances, and to the extent that audiences are looking for the familiar, they're not looking for the same thing. My theory about this is that within a couple of years, once you've taken those interesting chances and other filmmakers have seen people take it, they're going to start going in that direction too, if the chances were indeed interesting. So I think over time, the audience will catch up to the critics and those kinds of films. Eric, what's the experience in television? I don't actually know.
It's interesting because it used to be, I'd say when I first started covering television back in 1997, it used to be that film was where people took chances and TV was where they played it safe. Because the way TV made money back then, especially, was that it had to draw these big audiences. So they were fearful of putting anything on television that might cause a segment of the audience to fall away. But now we're at a point where most of these media platforms make money by appealing to very specific audiences and very specific tastes. So you see a lot more risk taking. You see a lot more very specific storytelling and focus on, sort of an ideal consumer, and much less worry about, in the case of Euphoria, if I put in this graphically explicit sex scene, will it make a bunch of people not watch it? They don't care about that. They want to make sure that the auteur who's put it all together gets to tell the story the way they want, and they want to make sure that the target audience feels like this is what I want to see. So I feel like it's hard for me to think of situations where, I thought something was really good, but like everybody kind of slept on it. Like I wish Underground Railroad, for example, had done better. But I acknowledged when I wrote about it that it was something you had to watch 8 episodes of it, and 6 episodes of it is really punishing, tough to watch stuff. And I sort of understood how people could watch the first couple of episodes, which are really the toughest to get through, and just sort of say, man, I can't do it. I totally understood that. So I feel like, a lot of times when really great TV shows don't pop the way you want them to, there's sort of understandable reasons for why it doesn't happen. But what's interesting is, like, how do we judge that something is high quality or considered really well made? For my money, a lot of times movies that get a lot of Oscar nominations are not necessarily the best things that I've seen. I mean, Promising Young Woman is a good example. Like, that's a film that I liked. That's a film that I thought had great performances in it. But I felt like I could name 4 or 5 things I saw on TV that were better than that.
Mhm.
That and I was, once I finally saw the movie, I was kind of surprised at how much Oscar buzz it had. Because I'm thinking to myself, I mean, this is good, but is this like the best that the movie industry has to offer in that year? Or are people sort of caught up in the story of how it was made and who made it, and in particular the star's performance was amazing? Are they caught up in that? So
I'm forever seeing films I don't think that a judgment of what the audience feels about something should necessarily be made by the box office or the attendance numbers. I'm just, or the viewership numbers. For instance, I saw a film called 9 Days earlier this year. It was, sorry, we're now in the new year, late last year. And it was extraordinary in a lot of ways. And I knew from the word go it was not going to be a huge hit. But it was interesting and perplexing, and it's a film about sort of a gatekeeper. It sounds like Soul when I describe it, the Pixar movie. It's a gatekeeper who is auditioning souls for bodies in a netherworld that you are not quite sure about. And Winston Duke is the sort of otherworldly bureaucrat who is making the call as to whether souls get paired up with bodies. And it's just a fascinating film. And it's a first-time filmmaker, and Winston Duke is the big name in it. Zazie Bates is the second big name. There was no way that was going to attract a lot of audience, right? And I made a case for reviewing it on NPR because we do all things considered, not just, the popular stuff. And so I did a review of it, and I talked about it again not too long ago. Well, now it's on streaming and anybody can go see it. When I talked about it on Pop Culture Happy Hour, I got all of these in my Twitter threads were suddenly filled with people saying, "Oh my God, thank you for pointing me at that movie," right? Because they just loved it. So I think that the audience doesn't necessarily go initially, but catches up with something. The movie I saw. People often ask a critic, "What is your favorite something?" Right? And I can't tell you what. I mean, when you see as many movies as I have, you don't really have a favorite. But there is a movie that I've seen more than any other movie, Harold and Maude, which I saw a zillion years ago, and which is crazy wonderful in its way. But nobody went to see that initially, right? I mean, that was a nothing. It has since made lots of money, and it's been quite successful because word of mouth got around slowly about this film that died in theaters initially because Godfather came out at about the same moment, and it just wasn't paid any attention to. So I saw that 19 times. Right? I mean, that spoke to me. Now, I will grant you that the rationale for going to see it was a little odd. The leading man, Bud Cort, and I share a birthday, and I found that out early. And I sort of identified with him when I was 19, and so it was, but that's something that I think critics liked back then for the most part, and that audiences came along later. And that, I mean, West Side Story, which I think is now regarded as a huge classic, both film and theater, when it was first produced on Broadway, didn't run 2 years and was not a big hit. I mean, people kept talking about how you couldn't sing the music until they made the movie, at which point all of a sudden everybody could suddenly sing the music because you were hearing it all the time. And I think sometimes it just takes a while. I don't know that critical viewpoints and audience viewpoints are really all that different necessarily. I think sometimes critics get there a little faster, and that's the big difference.
So we have another question from a viewer, and there are some pieces that both of you have discussed. For example, the documentary by Questlove, Summer of Soul, about the 1969 Harlem Cultural Festival, which celebrated Black history, and it was 100 miles south of Woodstock, and it pretty much got pushed out of the spotlight at the time. And this person is asking, with the line blurring, so you both talked about what a compelling piece of work that is. So the line blurring between movies and TV, how do you determine if something is for Bob to review or for Eric to review? And do you ever have to arm wrestle over it?
I was gonna say knives.
Absolutely.
Knives in a cage match is how we decide most of this stuff. And Bob usually wins.
No, arm wrestling is not my forte. I would, in general, I review things that are. I've asked Eric a couple of times if I could do something that was exclusively television, because it has a theatrical basis or something like that. I feel like I was born to review this one. You know, if he'll let me do it, that would be great. We don't fight over these things ever, and there are enough shows on NPR that if we both felt strongly about something, there's no problem with both of us doing it. I mean, we're not going to have the same take, so yep. It's perfectly reasonable. So there isn't really a problem with that. I did Hamilton, and I don't think Hamilton played in theaters, did it? When they did it on TV.
That was on Disney.
Yeah, it was just a sort of direct to streaming, and I did it because I cared about the theater. It was a recreation of a theatrical moment in 2016. They had filmed the show over the course of 4 days in a theater, so I felt like I was qualified to talk about that in a way that was just, I didn't want to give it up. But there's, we don't have those. We don't have to fight over things by and large. But if it's exclusively in theaters initially, Eric has so much else to do. He probably doesn't have time unless it's a Marvel movie. But you comment on those too, right?
I have. I mean, basically, the industry is still trying really hard to delineate this line between film and TV, mostly for awards reasons. The studios want their best, their most likely to be nominated for Oscars projects to be considered films. They don't want them to be considered television. So even if they're on streaming, even if they're available to be seen on streaming platforms pretty soon after they're initially released. So a lot of times I don't hear about stuff, or they won't tell TV critics about stuff, because they want to be able to maintain this sort of weird deniability where they can say, Mank is a movie, it's not a TV show. Roma is a movie, it's not a TV show. I didn't really hear much about either of those projects because Netflix was determined to make sure that they were considered Oscar contenders and not considered television. So the industry still has this weird, dividing line, and so that often, Bob or some of our other critics who also do film, they'll hear about a project before I hear it, they'll see it before I see it, and so it just makes sense for them to do it.
I'm old enough to oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, and I was just going to say, so it's not so much us, tussling over stuff, is the industry is trying to be careful about which of us review something. A lot of times they would rather Bob review it because they want it to be considered a film.
Yeah, I'm old enough. I hate to keep harping on my age. This whippersnapper here is a youngster, but I remember when the Washington Post had a theater and film critic, a single person covering both theater and film, and I remember it changing, and they brought in a film critic there for the first time at a time when I wasn't willing. I was a theater nut. I wasn't willing to concede that film was worthy of that, right? And so I think the separation between forms is an artificial one in terms of criticism, and there's no reason that Eric couldn't cover film and theater and all kinds of other things. My title at NPR isn't even film critic; it is arts critic, right? I'm the senior arts critic, senior in the old sense, and But
when did you start working at NPR?
1984.
So you started working at NPR in 1984 as somebody who specialized in film and theater. I came on to NPR as a TV critic in 2013.
Right.
So that tells you.
No, for all those years, I was NPR's only critic. Oh well, no, Linda Holmes started at Pop Culture Happy Hour, but yes, I was the only critic there for a long time, and for a while, NPR didn't think that criticism was worthy of a full-time position. It took me a long time before I was actually on staff. Now we have, is it five or six critics on staff regularly? So I feel like I pioneered, and we're moving ahead all the time. But
I think we have five technically, because Stephen Thompson is NPR Music, so he's not really considered a critic. But yeah.
So I just want to say to our audience, we have less than 10 minutes left before we wrap this up. So if you have some questions that you haven't been brave enough to put into the Q&A, go ahead and do that now. I want to ask something else from Taylor Montalto, who's asking about the film festival landscape as more independent filmmakers are making themselves known. He is, or she, programming director for a regional film festival in Charlotte. And they've had to navigate, I guess, the virtual in-person hybrid models of festivals. Is the hybrid here to stay as you attend Sundance virtually?
Boy, I don't know. That's a good question. I have never been to Sundance before. I went last year for the first time because it went virtual, and it was not a problem, right? I signed up, and I'm now a critic who's attending Sundance. The Toronto Film Festival went pretty much all virtual for a year, and then tried to do some this past one tried to do some virtual screenings as well. Virtual and in-person screenings with not a whole lot of success. I mean, it was the festivals have been struggling with whether they can actually attract an audience safely to theaters because festivals tend to play to sold-out houses, which is not the experience that most people have in movie theaters generally. I think the hybrid model is kind of wonderful, but I have to say I much prefer to see movies in theaters with an audience. And that includes films that are not necessarily big, splashy movies. I remember seeing Lion, which had Dev Patel in it, him trying to find his parents. And he had grown up in Australia, and he was now going back to India to find his parents. A gorgeous movie. I mean, just kind of wonderful and lovely. And I remember the audience all sort of standing up as the credits began, but the scene was still going on, right? And behind it. And a character was saying something about a character that you had dealt with earlier in the film. And because it was a true story, they were showing you the real person. And I remember everybody on their feet and then sitting back down. And even though they were, 3 seats over from where they had been, right, because there were people already leaving, and sitting back down to watch the end and sobbing. And you don't get that at home. And had I seen that movie virtually, that experience would have been different. And it affected everything about the way I reviewed it. It was an extraordinary thing. And so I think the theatrical experience in that case made a big difference. And seeing it with a crowd, even though that crowd is critics and trying not to respond audibly, it's valuable. And so I think I wouldn't want to be programming a film festival. I'm more power to you if you can do it, but it's got to be difficult right now. But I think there are advantages to it. One of which is that I'm going to watch a film after I finish this conversation, which I would have had to give up one of the two things. I would have either come back from Sundance early, or I would have had to give up this talk. So there are certainly advantages to the hybrid model. I hope it continues in some form, but I really can't tell you how much I can't wait to get back into theaters.
Yeah, I think that the high status festivals like Sundance will probably resist going back to the hybrid model if they don't have to, for exactly the reasons that Bob outlined. That so much of the impact of the festival is having everybody in one place. I did attend Sundance in person once, and it is really a powerful thing to be in a theater with a bunch of other people. But I will also tell you that in the virtual version, I've been able to see many more films. I've just been able to take in a lot more of the product. And part of the Sundance experience for me, because especially when I went, I went to moderate a panel, and I'm not a film critic. So a lot of it for me was calling up publicists and trying to get tickets and trying to sneak into this popular screening and sneak into that popular screening and all of that. I had to do a lot of tap dancing to get into some of these screenings because I'm not part of the film world, and they didn't necessarily know me. But virtually I can see whatever I want, and I have 8 days to do it. So there's value there, but I think the bigger festivals will probably resist it. I think some of the smaller ones, like even like Tribeca, I've been able to watch some stuff online there for a few years now, and I'm never gonna take time to go to New York to go through to see those products and the projects there. But I did take some time to watch. They put the shorts online, and I did take time to watch the shorts because I could access them virtually, and I could get a sense of what they were showing. So it'll be interesting to see how much pressure there is for them to continue to offer the hybrid model, because I think there's a lot of value to it. If you're somebody who's differently abled, it would make it a lot easier getting around Park City. I couldn't imagine trying to get around Park City. If I was differently abled. I mean, when I was there was a huge snowstorm and all of that. So I don't know. I hope they continue to offer it, but I wouldn't be surprised if they tried to at least limit it very severely.
So I want to get to a final question, and it's a version of what's your favorite piece, but not necessarily your favorite. What's the one piece, whether TV series, TV show, or film, that you think people should not die without seeing?
Wow.
Wow.
Well, on television, I have an answer. You want me to answer why you think, Bob, or do you have one?
No, you go for it.
So my answer for television would be The Wire, HBO's The Wire. I wrote an essay for the BBC last year about why I thought it was the best show in the 21st century so far. And it not only, this, if you don't know it, it was a series that ran for 5 seasons on HBO, and it started out centered on these police officers in Baltimore who were trying to bring down a drug ring that had taken over a set of housing projects in West Baltimore. these guys were very cagey and very savvy, and they didn't offer many opportunities for the police to apprehend them, and they were killing witnesses. And so a couple of cops got upset and said, we should be able to take these guys down, but found that the bureaucracy of the police department almost made it impossible. And the story is about them trying to figure out how to arrest these guys using a bug, a wire. And it expands to become the story about all these things. The creator, David Simon, is someone who talks a lot about systems. He doesn't focus so much on individual characters. He wants to tell stories about systems. So he's talking about how the drug game sort of became the company store in poor neighborhoods. No business really existed in those places, no commerce of any kind of any note, except for what the drug trade bought. So you had kids coming out of high school, and instead of going to work in the steel mill or trying to find a job in construction where they could make a middle-class living and labor, they would go into drug corners because that's where the work was. And then he talked about the bureaucracy of the police department and why the war on drugs didn't make any sense, and the ways in which the war on drugs became a war on poor people and a war on communities of color, and how police became these soldiers who saw poor Black people as their enemy rather than the people that they were supposedly protecting. And then he talked about how work was vanishing from the docks and from these areas where people could earn a middle class living in labor. And then he talked about the educational system in the fourth season, and then he talked about the media finally in the fifth season. And so if you want to look at all the issues that ail the modern urban city, The Wire gives you all of those things, and it does it in a way that predicted the way we'd be telling stories on television right now. And on top of all of that, you get to see all these great performances from people like Idris Elba and Dominic West and just all these great actors who, once you watch The Wire, you'll go, oh, I saw that person in Game of Thrones. Oh, I saw that person in Fast and Furious. Oh, I saw that person. There's so many actors who went on, including the great Michael K. Williams, who left us last year, who started their careers as notable actors on The Wire. So that's what I would say. You got to see The Wire before you die.
What a gorgeous answer. That's really wonderful. David Simon and I were in college together many years ago. He went to the University of Maryland, which is where I met him. He worked on the student newspaper, and that's where I first met him. Yes to The Wire, absolutely. I spent the first few seconds of Eric's answer thinking, okay, what can I possibly say? And I realized that my approach to film, because film never does all of those things the way that a television show can over the course of several seasons. And I started thinking, okay, the thing that is magical to me about film when it is magical is the brilliance of performance and of directing and of presence on screen. And I over the years, I do come from theater. My first love was theater. I went to it all the time. Not just musicals, but plays and Tennessee Williams and Tom Stoppard and all the greats of theater. And I love theatrical writing. And movies are different from that. And movies do occasionally have brilliant writing, but words aren't really what movies absorb well. And there is a perfection in a kind of movement that I think that is unique to film, that is exemplified by a certain kind of film that is not popular anymore. And the thing I would say that you must see, and it is one of quite a few things that you could see of this sort, is the silent film, black and white, Buster Keaton's The General. Now, this is about, the general is a locomotive. He is a Confederate soldier, and the locomotive has been stolen, and he has to go and get it back. And this is it is a work that fully engaged him in a way that he always was. All of his movies are kind of brilliant, but this one is extraordinary and epic. It's just enormous, and it left a locomotive in a gorge in Oregon, because when they had a scene where a locomotive had to go across a bridge and it had to fall into the gorge. I mean, they had set up a thing so that the locomotive couldn't come across, and that was how Buster Keaton survived this trauma of being chased by the Yankee soldiers. And so they had to set fire to the bridge, and the locomotive had to fall, because you couldn't do that through some kind of a special effect. And all of the scenes where he's shooting a cannon at something, and because of the twisting of the way that the trains are going on the tracks, it accidentally shoots the thing that he wanted it to shoot. Or they managed to stop a train by his girlfriend is in the cabin of the locomotive with him, and while he's filling the car up with logs to stoke the steam engine, she's outside and tying a rope between these two little saplings on either side of the tracks to block the other locomotive. And he looks at her like she's lost her mind, and she gets into the train, and then they pull away, and the other train comes along, and it immediately, of course, pulls up both of the saplings, which get tangled in its wheels, and it stops the train. So it worked, but they had to actually do that, right? This is not something that they could do through some kind of special effect. The magic of that movie is extraordinary. It's just extraordinary. And when you realize that everything in it he's doing himself, there is a brilliance to that man that is, it moves me when I just think about it, let alone when I actually see it. I had the great experience and a fundraiser for KUER, a station in Salt Lake City. They asked me what movie I wanted to show in a theater that was built in 1924, because they had rented the place and they wanted to do something about silent films, because they had an organist there to actually play for the movie. And they had a big Wurlitzer, and it was just gorgeous. And I got to see that with 1,200 people in a theater built in 1924, which is very close to the year that the film came out. And I listened to them gasp in the same places that audiences would have in the 20s at this silent movie. And I'm choking up remembering this. It was so absolutely magical to see it that way. And so I wish for everyone to have that experience, but happily, the movie The General can be found in a pristine print if you just go online, and it's so extraordinary. It's just such a wonderful, magical thing. So I guess I would point you to that and hope that it led you to the Chaplin films and the Harold Lloyd films and the other wonderful silent comedians that just did extraordinary work, and that invented the form before words and music and other things sort of tarnished it, right? They invented something that was very pure. And one of my favorite critics, Walter Kerr, who used to write about theater, wrote a book called The Silent Clowns, which is really beautiful. And he said something that I thought was strange when I first read it. He said that that silence was something that films should really have come to. It was something that they would reach afterwards, because motion pictures are all about motion, right? And that the distractions of sound would tear it away from that for many years. And it did. I mean, now we've accepted a certain kind of movement in films that is accompanied by all kinds of special effects and sounds and things that are explosive and big and extravagant, and just acres of music for everything. But that the pristine, the pure quality of black and white film was magical and brought audiences into the fold in the first place. The reason it became the most popular form of art that the world had ever known was that it could transcend all boundaries of language and experience, really, because it was photographic and it could show you the world, but it could show you a world in a way you hadn't seen it. And black and white contributed to that, and silence contributed to that. And I think if people can bring themselves to watch it, I mean, it's tricky to talk people into going and looking, but The General would be a wonderful entry-level drug on that of that sort. It is magic. It really is magic.
Buster Keaton's The General and the TV series The Wire. That's your assignment, and that's our time this evening. This has been such a enlightening conversation for me. It has been illuminating in so many ways. We appreciate you both so much, Eric Deggans and Bob Mondello. What a pleasure it's been to have you with us tonight. Thanks to all of you who joined us this evening, those of you who contributed brilliant questions, those of you who just showed up, sat back, and enjoyed the conversation. We really appreciate you spending time with us tonight. Thanks also to NPR's Emily Dagger and WHQR's Mary Bradley and Kim Carr, who made all of this happen. And if you're not a member of the WHQR community and you enjoyed this evening and would like to support this public media station, head over to WHQR.org. I'm Rachel Lewis Hilburn. Thank you so much, and good night.